$2. That was what Harlow slid across the white tablecloth. $2. In front of a full restaurant. On a Thursday afternoon in one of the most expensive dining rooms in Manhattan. She told the waitress not to spend it all in one place. The table laughed. Nobody else said anything. The waitress standing at table 6 with a bread plate in her hands was worth $95 billion. She owned the building. She had approved every fixture in this room. She had signed the lease 7 years ago in an empty shell of a space and imagined exactly this. Her name was Wren Calloway. The name tag said Cole. Nobody knew. She had been invisible for 6 weeks. No security detail. No board meetings. No one holding a door before she reached it. Just a uniform and an order pad and a restaurant full of people who looked straight through her. That was the point. She heard Harlow before she saw her. The laugh first. Then the voice. Loud in the way of someone who has never once worried about taking up too much space. Table 6. For women. Designer everything. The kind of group Wren had sat with at 100 charity events across this city. She knew the type the way you know a language you grew up speaking. Every word. Every gesture. Every unspoken rule about who mattered and who did not. She had taken their order without making eye contact. Brought the water. Brought the bread. Checked the table twice. Not one of the 4 women had looked at her face once. That was the thing about being poor in a rich room. You became furniture. Present but unnoticed. Functional but forgettable. Wren had spent her entire adult life being looked at. Being assessed. Every room she walked into as herself people rearranged around her without knowing why. You could feel $95 billion on a person even when they were dressed simply. It had a weight to it that rooms registered before people did. Here she was just the waitress who refilled the water. She was reaching for the bread plate when Pemba leaned back in her chair and said it loud enough for 3 tables to hear. She said some women were built for certain things. That you could always tell which women were meant to serve and which ones were meant to be served. That it was obvious. That some people were just born into their place in the world and this girl was clearly in hers. The table laughed. Dex raised her phone and filmed it. Harlow looked at Wren the way you look at something that is mildly interesting for about 4 seconds. Then she pushed $2 across the tablecloth with one finger and told her not to spend it all in one place. Wren did not move. The room was full. Every table occupied. Conversations had gone quiet. People were looking now. Not at Harlow. At Wren. Waiting to see what the waitress would do. Whether she would cry. Whether she would snap back. Whether she would give them something worth watching. She gave them nothing. She stood with the bread plate and looked at the $2 and felt the specific weight of a room full of people who had seen exactly what happened and had decided their meal was more important than saying so. She had heard that silence her whole life. In hospital waiting rooms. In boardrooms. In the private dining rooms of people who smiled at her face and counted her money when she turned around. Silence was its own language. It said we see it and we are choosing our plates instead. It said the cost of speaking is higher than the cost of your dignity and we already did the math. Not one person in that room opened their mouth. And then a chair moved. Just the ordinary scrape of a chair on a floor. But in that silence it was the loudest thing in the room. A man stood up from a corner table near the window. She had noticed him when he came in. He arrived with an older woman. His mother most likely. They had studied the menu longer than most people did. They had ordered carefully. 2 people who had thought about whether they could afford to be here and had decided tonight was worth it anyway. He was not remarkable in the way this room defined remarkable. No obvious wealth. No table presence. Just a man in clean clothes who had pushed back his chair and stood up. He walked across the room. The whole restaurant watched him. He stopped at table 6. He looked at Harlow. Then at Pemba. Then at Dex with her phone still raised. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform for the room. He said what they had just done, said everything about who they were and absolutely nothing about who she was. He said every person in this room had watched it happen and the women at this table had made a decision about who they were in the last 3 minutes, and it was not a good one. He was not loud. He did not need to be. Harlow's expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise. Then the irritation of someone who is not used to being addressed this way in public. She said something about minding his own business. He said a woman being humiliated in a public room was everyone's business. He said that whatever they believed about themselves, it did not give them the right to treat another person as entertainment. That dignity was not a function of income. That they had filmed a person without her consent and laughed at her in front of a full restaurant and called it a joke. He paused. He said it was not a joke. The table had nothing left. Harlow looked at her water glass. Dex put her phone in her purse. The fourth woman had been staring at the tablecloth for the last 40 seconds. Then he turned to Wren. She had not moved. She was still standing at the edge of the table with her order pad and the $2 on the white linen in front of her. He looked at her directly. Not with pity. Not with the tenderness of someone who wants credit for noticing your pain. Just directly. Person to person. He said he was sorry. Not sorry this happened as a general statement released into the air. Sorry aimed at her. He was sorry that it happened to her. That nobody else had said anything. That she had been standing there alone in it. Wren opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She nodded once. He nodded back. He walked to the front of the restaurant. Paid his bill at the counter. Helped his mother with her coat. Held the door for an older couple coming in, and then he was gone. No backward glance. No pause at the window. No moment of waiting to be seen having done the right thing. He had simply done it and left. Wren picked up the $2 and put them in her apron pocket and carried the bread plate back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and counted to 11. It did not work at all this time. She stood there and felt something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. Not gratitude exactly. Deeper than that. The specific feeling of being seen by someone who wanted absolutely nothing in return for seeing you. She had $95 billion. A foundation operating in 11 countries. An apartment on the 54th floor that had been silent for longer than she told anyone. And she was standing in the kitchen of her own restaurant in a $20 uniform, and she could not stop thinking about a man who had done nothing except refuse to look away. She finished her shift. She went to the parking structure and sat in her car and did not start the engine for 22 minutes. She thought about the reservation system she had full access to. Her chief of staff Corvin Nash could pull the records in 4 minutes. She could have a complete profile on this man before midnight. She did not move. She sat in the dark and thought about what it meant that the first thing she wanted to do was use her money to find him. And what it said about every relationship she had ever tried to build, that using her money was still the first tool she reached for even now. She started the car. But she went back the next morning and asked Otis the dishwasher if he knew anything about the man from the corner table near the window. Otis said he came in every third Thursday. Regular as weather. Always the same table. Always with his mother. Wren looked at the calendar on her phone. 20 days. To understand why Wren Calloway was sitting in a waitress uniform in her own restaurant parking garage, you have to go back 3 years. Before the uniform there was an office on the 14th floor of a building on 5th Avenue. Before the office there was a doctor. Before the doctor there was a man named Philip who had said he loved her in 4 countries and meant it in none of them. Dr. Vashti Crane sat across from her on a Tuesday afternoon and read from a file and said the word fibroid the way doctors say difficult words. Carefully. Like the word itself might break something if dropped too fast. The chances of carrying a pregnancy to term were not impossible. That was how Dr. Crane phrased it. Not impossible. Which meant the same thing as not guaranteed. Which meant the same thing as we cannot promise you this. Wren had nodded. Thanked the doctor. Walked to the elevator and stood with her hands folded in front of her while the doors closed. She cried alone in the parking garage for 19 minutes. Then she called her driver and went back to work. She told exactly 2 people. Her sister Blythe. And Philip. They had been engaged for 7 months when she told him. He said the right things in the room. He held her hand across the dinner table and told her it did not change anything. He asked for 2 weeks to think. He never came back. A message through his attorney 6 days later citing irreconcilable differences in life goals. Clean. Legal. Efficient. She sat with that word for a long time. Goals. As if she were a failed investment. As if what the doctor had said about her body was a performance issue that could be noted in a file and used to justify an exit. After Philip there was Marcus, who said he loved her and meant it until his family started asking questions about children and legacy. He did not leave cruelly. He left apologetically, which was somehow worse. He held her face in his hands and told her she deserved someone without those pressures. What he meant was that she deserved someone else. After Marcus there was a man whose name she had mostly stopped saying out loud. He disappeared without explanation. No call. No message. There 1 week and gone the next. She found out through Blythe 3 months later that he had gotten engaged to someone else. A woman he had been seeing for 4 months, while telling Wren she was the most remarkable person he had ever met. 3 men. 3 versions of the same ending. The money had not helped. People assumed wealth was insulation. That $95 billion was a buffer between a person and ordinary pain. It was not. It was a filter. It removed everyone who wanted the money quickly and left behind only the one skilled enough to want her first and the money second. Those were the harder ones to lose. Because with Philip she had believed it. She had looked across the dinner table and thought, this one sees me. Not the company. Not the assets. Not the name on the building. Me. She had been wrong in the way you can only be wrong about something you wanted very badly to be true. After the 3rd loss she stopped explaining herself to new people. She stopped going to events where men learned her name before they learned her face. She worked. She ran the company. She attended the galas she funded and smiled at the correct moments. And she went home to the 54th floor and the apartment that had been silent for longer than she told anyone, including Blythe. Now back to the restaurant. Back to the present. The decision to go undercover had not come dramatically. It came on a Wednesday night when she was sitting at her kitchen counter eating alone, reading a profile of herself in a financial magazine. The profile described her as formidable. Untouchable. A woman who had built an empire through ruthless clarity of vision. She read it twice. She thought about the parking garage. The 19 minutes. The drive back to the office with her hands folded in her lap and nobody to call. Then she called Blythe and said she needed to disappear for a while. She called Corvin the next morning and told him she needed 60 days. He told her that was reckless. She told him to manage it. Then she went to the one place in the world nobody would look for Wren Calloway. The bottom of her own restaurant. The manager's name was Denton. 34 years old. 3 years with the company. He had absolutely no idea that the woman standing in front of him in a borrowed uniform had signed his employment contract personally. He looked at her application for 11 seconds. Then he looked at her. He said she had no recent hospitality experience. She said she was a fast learner. He hired her at minimum wage with a 2-week probationary period and told her if she broke more than 2 glasses she would be docked. The first week was physical in a way she had not prepared for. 8 hours on hard floors in rubber-soled shoes that were not broken in. By Wednesday her feet had blistered on both heels. By Friday she had learned to wrap them before her shift started. She ate standing in the back corridor between the kitchen and the dry storage because there was nowhere else and because the break room had an unspoken seating arrangement she had not yet earned a place in. The staff assessed her within the first 3 days. Lena, who worked the morning section, decided Wren was too quiet to be trusted. Marco, the senior server, decided she was too slow to last. A woman named Priya, who had worked the floor for 4 years, watched carefully for a week and then told Lena that something was off about the new girl. That she held herself wrong for someone who needed the job. Priya was the closest to the truth. Wren made note of that. Denton docked her pay in the first week for a table complaint that was not her fault. A kitchen delay on a medium rare order that went out well done. The guest complained to Denton directly and Denton wrote Wren up without asking her side. She stood in his office and listened and said yes sir and walked out and went back to the floor. She thought about what it meant to have no recourse. To know that the write-up would sit in a file and affect her hours and there was nothing she could do about it except be careful and invisible and useful enough to keep. There were 17 layers of management between Denton and the person who owned this building. Wren knew every name on every layer. She said nothing. By week 3 she was faster. Her feet had adjusted. She had learned that Marco was generous with his knowledge once he decided you were serious. She had learned that Otis had worked in this building since before Wren bought it and knew more about its daily operation than anyone on the management team. She had also learned what it felt like to be tired in a way that had nothing to do with stress or strategy. Just the flat physical exhaustion of a body that had been on its feet for 9 hours carrying plates and smiling at people who did not see her. She had never been this tired in her life. She had also never felt this real. The work stripped everything back. No performance required. No version of herself to maintain. She was just a woman doing a job, and the simplicity of that was something she had not known she was starving for. She was thinking about that on a Thursday afternoon in her 6th week when the door opened and she heard Harlow's laugh carry across the room. What happened next you already know. She did not pull the reservation records after. She asked Otis instead. Then she called Corvin. His name was Stellan Merritt. 36 years old. Structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Lower Manhattan. Modest mortgage on a 1-bedroom in Astoria. His work had been cited in 2 industry publications for a bridge rehabilitation project in the Bronx. No outstanding debt. No red flags in any direction. Corvin had added a note at the bottom of the file. As requested, no contact has been made and no further investigation has been initiated. His way of saying he had noticed the boundary and was respecting it, and also that the boundary existed, which meant something unusual was happening. Wren read the file 3 times. Then she read the part about Rosalind Merritt. She lived in the same building as Stellan. Different floor. He had bought her the apartment 2 years ago according to property records Corvin had included without being asked. He had bought his mother an apartment in his building on a structural engineer's salary with a tight mortgage. Not a gesture? A decision. He had looked at his life and decided his mother should be close, and he had made that happen with whatever he had available to him. She thought about Philip, who had sent a message through his attorney. She thought about Marcus, who had held her face in his hands. She did not sleep well that night. He came back on a Thursday exactly as Otis had said he would. Same table. Same time. Rosalind beside him in a cream-colored cardigan with a book still marked with her thumb from the subway ride over. Wren brought the water. Stellan looked up when she set the glass down and recognition moved quietly across his face. He said hello. She said hello back. She took their order and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter a moment longer than necessary. He did not bring up what had happened. Not that visit. He ate his dinner and talked with his mother and left a tip that was larger than it needed to be and said good night on the way out with the same ease he said everything. The Thursday after that he came alone. Rosalind had a cold, he said when Wren asked. She had refused to cancel and he had refused to let her come. He said they had argued about it for 10 minutes and he had won only because he had hidden her coat. Wren laughed. It came out before she could manage it. Real and unguarded in a way she had not laughed in a room with another person in longer than she could accurately measure. Stellan looked at her when she laughed. Not with surprise. With attention. The specific quality of attention that means a person is filing something away carefully. After that Thursday it became a different thing. He started arriving a few minutes early. She started checking his table first. The conversations grew longer. He asked about her week without the performance of asking. He listened to the answer without preparing his response while she was still talking. He remembered things. Small things. That she took her coffee without sugar. That she had mentioned once she could not sleep when it rained. That she had a sister she spoke about carefully in the way of someone who loves a person and worries about them in equal measure. 3 Thursdays in a row and Wren understood that she was in trouble. Not the complicated financial, legal, operational trouble she was trained to manage. The other kind. The kind that did not have a risk assessment framework. The kind that just sat in the middle of your chest and waited. She told Blythe on a Sunday call that she had met someone. Blythe went very quiet. Then she asked if this was related to the restaurant situation. Wren said it was complicated. Blythe said that was not a no. She said Wren always needed more time and that one day more time was going to run out and she hoped Wren would notice before that happened. The guilt had been building since the second Thursday. Not the guilt of doing something wrong exactly. The guilt of allowing someone to know a version of you that is real in every way except the ways that might change everything. Because she was real with him. That was the unbearable part. Everything she had shown Stellan merit in those Thursday evenings was true. The laugh was real. The exhaustion was real. The way she felt sitting across from someone who listened without an agenda was real. She was not performing Wren Cole the waitress. She was just Wren. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was just herself in a room with another person and it was working. And it was built on something that would eventually collapse. She knew what happened when men learned the full truth about her. Not just the money. The other thing. The thing Dr. Crane had said in that quiet office 3 years ago. Not impossible. But not guaranteed. She kept telling herself she would tell him. Next Thursday. The Thursday after. When the time was right. She ran out of Thursdays. It was a Wednesday when it happened. She was finishing a double shift. The restaurant was nearly empty. Stellan had come in unscheduled for the first time. He said he was in the neighborhood. She believed it for about 4 seconds. He sat at the counter near the service station while she finished closing her tables. He was looking at his phone when she came back. She saw the screen before she could look away. He had searched her name. Not Cole. The other one. She did not know how he had found it. She only knew from the way he looked up and the way his face had gone very still that whatever he had read was not in the version of her he knew. He said her real last name. Quietly. Like a question that already knew its answer. Wren said nothing. The restaurant was empty. Otis was in the back. There was nobody left in the room but the two of them and the thing she had not been ready for. And then the front door opened. Harlow walked in. Not for a reservation. Not for dinner. She had been calling Corvin's office for 2 weeks trying to reach Wren directly and getting nowhere and had apparently decided to try the restaurant itself on the theory that Wren Calloway might be found in a place that carried her name. She stopped when she saw Wren behind the counter. It took 4 full seconds. Wren watched it happen in real time. The confusion first. Then the slow recalibration. Then the particular expression of someone who has just understood that they slid $2 across a tablecloth to a billionaire and the billionaire had taken them and said nothing and gone back to work. Harlow said her name. The real one. Out loud. In the empty restaurant. Stellan heard it. He looked at Harlow. Then back at Wren. Then at the counter between them where the apron was still folded. He looked at Wren the way a person looks when a large piece of information has just arrived and the landing was not gentle. Harlow started talking. Something about a misunderstanding. Something about context. Something about how she had always been a great supporter of Wren's foundation work and hoped there were no hard feelings, and that if Wren had a moment she would love to speak privately. Wren looked at her for a long moment. She thought about a bread plate. $2 on white linen. A phone raised to film a woman in a uniform. A room full of people who had chosen their plates. Then she said that the restaurant was closed for the evening and that Corvin would be in touch if there was anything to discuss. Harlow opened her mouth. Wren looked at her steadily and said nothing further. Harlow left. The door closed behind her and the room went quiet again. Stellan had not moved from the counter. He was watching Wren with an expression she could not fully read. Not anger. Not calculation. Something that was trying to decide what it was. She looked at him. She said she could explain. He said she should probably start. She took off her apron. Folded it on the counter between them. Sat down on the stool across from him and told him the truth. All of it. She started with the restaurant. She told him she owned it. Had owned it for 7 years. That the building above them and the 4 other locations across the city and the 11 international properties all belonged to her. That Denton, who had docked her pay twice, did not know. That every shift she had worked for 6 weeks had been her own choice in her own building under a name that was half hers. Stellan did not speak. He listened the way he always listened. Completely. She told him about the company. Calloway Group. Private holding structure across 4 continents. Managed assets that had crossed $95 billion in the last fiscal quarter. She watched his face when she said the number. Something moved through it. Not greed. Not the particular brightening she had learned to recognize in people who were doing rapid calculations. Something closer to the expression of a person who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was a different shape than they thought. She kept going. She told him about Philip. About the attorney's message and the word goals and the 7 months she had spent believing she had finally found something real. She told him about Marcus and his family's expectations and the way he had held her face like that was a substitute for staying. She told him about the 3rd one without using his name. Then she told him about Dr. Vashti Crane. The office on the 14th floor. The file. The word fibroid delivered carefully. Not impossible but not guaranteed. She told him she had cried alone in a parking garage for 19 minutes and then gone back to work. She told him that every man who had learned this truth had eventually found a reason to leave and that she had stopped believing the reason was ever really about the diagnosis. The diagnosis was just the door. The money and the name and the weight of what she was had already made the room too small for anyone to stay in comfortably. She stopped talking. The restaurant was silent around them. The low light. The white tablecloths. The building she had built and owned and hidden inside for 6 weeks looking for something she could not buy and could not name until a man in a corner table had stood up from his chair. Stellan looked at his hands on the counter. He said she had lied to him. She said yes. He said not about small things. He said she had let him sit across from her for weeks and build something and she had known the whole time that the foundation of it was missing critical information and she had made that choice for him without asking whether he wanted to make it himself. She said yes. She said that was true and she was sorry and she understood if it changed things. He stood up from the stool. Wren felt the room shift. This was it. This was the version of the moment she had been afraid of since the 2nd Thursday. The moment where a man who had seemed different turned out to be the same. Where the chair that scraped across a restaurant floor 6 weeks ago turned out to mean something smaller than she had allowed herself to believe. He walked toward the door. She did not call after him. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would never be the person who called after someone who was already leaving. She sat on the stool and she put her hands flat on the counter and she breathed. She counted to 11. He stopped. His hand was on the door. He stood there without moving for long enough that the counting stopped working and the breathing became something she had to think about deliberately. She thought about the parking garage 3 years ago. The 19 minutes. How she had sat alone with something enormous and had nobody to hand any part of it to. How she had learned to fold things carefully and put them away in rooms nobody else was allowed into because that was the only way to keep them from being used against her. She thought about how well that had worked. Stellan turned around. He walked back to the counter and sat down. He said he understood why she had done it. He said that did not mean it had not hurt. He said those were two different things and he needed her to know he understood the difference. Then he said this. He said he had bought his mother an apartment in his building because she had raised him alone and he did not want her to be far from him. He said he made $31 an hour and the mortgage was tight and he did not care. The money was not the point. The being there was the point. He said he had stood up in this restaurant 6 weeks ago not because he wanted to be seen doing it but because he could not eat his dinner knowing he had watched something happen and said nothing. He said he was not interested in $95 billion. He said he was interested in the woman who had cried alone in a parking garage for 19 minutes and then gone back to work. He said that woman did not need to hide from him. Wren sat across the counter and felt something move through her chest and settle. She said she did not know how to do this without the wall. He said he knew. He said they could figure that out. She did not fire Denton immediately. She thought about it. She had thought about it for 6 weeks every time he spoke to her in the flat dismissive tone he reserved for staff he considered replaceable. But firing him the week after she revealed herself would have felt like using power to settle a personal score and she had spent her entire career refusing to be that kind of person. Instead she called a full operational review of every restaurant in the group. Standard procedure, she told Corvin. Quarterly assessment. He looked at her for 4 seconds and said of course. The review took 3 days. The findings landed on her desk in a clean folder. Denton's section was not clean. 3 formal complaints from staff in the past year that had not been escalated correctly. A pattern of pay adjustments that disproportionately affected newer female employees. 2 kitchen staff who had left without notice and cited management culture in exit interviews that nobody had followed up on. Denton was offered a retraining program and a transfer to a back-of-house administrative role at reduced management level. He accepted because the alternative was termination with cause. Marco got the floor manager position. He left a voicemail after the announcement that was 2 minutes long and slightly stunned in tone. He said he was not sure he deserved it but he would not waste it. She listened to it twice. As for Harlow, 3 weeks after the night at the counter a financial journalist published a profile of Wren Calloway. Standard career retrospective. Somewhere in the middle the journalist included 4 sentences about the undercover experiment. No names. Just the outline of what had happened and why. Those 4 sentences were the most read part of the piece by a significant distance. Within 48 hours the story had moved beyond the financial press. It was on lifestyle sites and social feeds and the kind of group conversations that happen over phones at dinner tables. People were not talking about the empire or the assets or the holding structure across 4 continents. They were talking about a woman who had been handed $2 in her own restaurant and had folded her apron and gone back to work. Harlow called Corvin's office the following Monday requesting a meeting with Wren directly. She called again on Wednesday. She sent a written request on Thursday that used the words admirer and longtime supporter in the first paragraph. Corvin told her on Friday that Ms. Calloway's schedule did not have availability in the foreseeable future. He said it pleasantly. He said it twice. Wren never took the call. Not because she was punishing Harlow. Because she had genuinely already moved on and Harlow was not a part of anything she was building. That was the quietest kind of consequence. Not a confrontation. Not a reversal. Just the steady forward motion of a person who had decided her attention was worth more than the satisfaction of looking back. Stellan still came on Thursdays. Different dynamic now. He came through the front entrance and was shown to the corner table by Marco, who handled it with a professionalism that made Wren quietly proud. She no longer wore the uniform. She sat across from him in her own clothes at her own table in her own restaurant and they talked the way they had always talked, except now there was nothing underneath the conversation waiting to detonate. It was the same. That was the thing she had not expected. Stripped of the secret, it was still the same. He still listened without preparing his response. He still remembered the small things. He still made her laugh in the unguarded way that came out before she could manage it. The wall she had told him she did not know how to dismantle was still partially there. She was honest about that. Some evenings she could feel herself reaching for it out of habit. A deflection here. A subject change before it got too close. A joke where a real answer would have served better. He noticed every time. He did not call it out. He did not make it a conversation. He just stayed in the room and kept being the same person he had been in every previous room and waited for her to catch up. That was the thing about Stellan Merritt. He stayed. For months after the counter-conversation, Wren told him about the diagnosis properly. Not the summary version she had delivered that night. The full version. The parking garage. The 19 minutes. The specific weight of sitting alone with something that large and having nobody to hand any part of it to. The 3 men and the 3 doors, and the way she had eventually stopped opening new doors because the cost of what waited on the other side of them had gotten too high. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said that not impossible was enough for him. That he was not interested in guarantees. That the only thing he needed to know was whether she was in this. She said she was in this. He said good. Then he said one more thing. He said that the night he stood up in the restaurant he had not done it for her specifically. He had done it because he could not do otherwise. But if he had known then what he knew now, he would have walked across that room a great deal faster. Wren looked at him across the table. She reached across and took his hand. There was one more thing she had not yet told him. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks. Not because she was afraid of his reaction. For the first time in a long time, she was not primarily afraid of someone's reaction. She had been carrying it because she was still getting used to the feeling of not having to carry things alone. She told him on a Sunday morning. She said she had made an appointment. With Dr. Vashti Crane. The same office. The same building. She said she did not know what the appointment would find, and she was not asking him to promise anything about what came after. She just wanted him to know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what time. She told him. He said he would be there. She looked at him across the table and said he did not have to do that. That she was used to going alone. That she had a system for it. He said he knew she had a system. He said he was not interested in her system. The following Tuesday morning she was sitting in a waiting room on the 14th floor of a building on 5th Avenue. The same building. The same office. The same low sound of climate control and the same chairs and the same particular quality of light that she had sat in 3 years ago when she was a different version of herself. A version that had walked in alone and counted to 11 in the elevator and cried for 19 minutes in a parking garage before deciding that the way to survive hard things was to fold them carefully and carry them quietly and never let anyone close enough to help with the weight. Stellan was sitting beside her. He had taken the morning off work. He had not needed her to explain what the appointment was because she had already told him everything, and he did not require explanations to be repeated. He had just asked what time and shown up and was now sitting in the chair next to hers with his coffee and his phone face down in his lap because he was the kind of person who put his phone face down when he was with someone. She looked at him in that waiting room. She thought about Philip, who had asked for 2 weeks and never come back. About Marcus, who had held her face and chosen his family's version of the future over hers. About the third one who had disappeared and gotten engaged to someone else while telling her she was the most remarkable person he had ever met. She thought about a chair scraping a floor. She thought about a man walking across a room not because someone was watching but because he could not eat his dinner knowing he had stayed seated. She thought about a door. His hand on it. The 11 seconds that had felt longer than 19 minutes in a parking garage. She thought about him walking back. The door to Dr. Crane's office opened. Wren stood up. Stellan stood up with her. She looked at him once more before they walked through. He had not stayed because of the money. He had not stayed because of the name or the company or the empire across 4 continents or anything she had built or owned or signed. He had stayed because of a woman who had stood at a table with $2 in front of her and given the room nothing and then gone back to work. He had stayed before the outcome. Before the appointment. Before the guarantee that did not exist and that he had already told her he was not looking for. She took his hand. They walked through the door together. Outside on 5th Avenue, Manhattan moved at its ordinary pace. Unbothered. Indifferent. The city that had watched her build an empire across 3 decades without ever once seeing her face clearly. In a waiting room on the 14th floor, 2 people sat across from a doctor. One of them had $95 billion. The other had $31 an hour and a tight mortgage and a mother in the apartment above his. Neither of those things were why they were in the room. They were in the room because 6 weeks ago a chair had scraped a floor. And one person had decided that was enough of a reason to stand up.